I was prepping some lumber for an upcoming project, and I saw these stamps that are on my boards, and I thought, let's talk about that for a second, because those could be really important to our projects and our pocketbooks. There's a lot of information crammed in these little stamps. And if you can decipher the code, then you know what lumber to use for what project. Stamps may look different, but they all kind of say the same thing. Now, if you go to your lumber yard and you see different types of stamps, then that means that the lumber is coming in from different geographic areas. And each one of those areas may have its own accrediting agency or body, and they regulate how that stamp looks. If you have all the same type of stamp, well, that means your lumber's probably come from the same geographic region. I picked up this 2x12, and looking at the stamp, I noticed it's telling me at least 5 different things. I see the inspection agency, the grade of the wood, the species of the wood, the sawmill that cut it up, and then the seasoning. First thing I noticed on my stamp is SPIB, that is the Southern Pine Inspection Bureau. They're based in Pensacola, Florida, which is my hometown. Michigan's very cold compared to there. It's the perfect place for that agency because it's nothing but pine trees. Have you ever tried to rake a bunch of pine needles up? It ain't fun. Your stamp may have a different inspection agency, but that's okay. Most of them follow the same rules or principles. They're supposed to work with different sawmills to make sure that they're following the American Softwood Lumber Standard, or the PS20. This is a document that's written by the US Department of Commerce. It really holds everything to one standard. That way, if I'm a customer and I go to the store and I buy a bunch of 2x4s, I don't have one that's like a 1x3 and one's a 2x4 and one's a 2x5, and it kind of keeps things lumped together the way they should be. I'll put a link to the PS20 down in the video description, and I recommend it. If you're a nerd like me, then you might really dig it. Speaking of nerding out, check this out. I was going through the shop trying to find different lumber stamps, and I noticed this. So take a look at that. Look at the growth rings on that board. Now compare it to this other board here that is a newer board. Look at the difference. This is old growth versus new growth. The reason why this just comes to mind is because I was watching a video on today's sponsor, Woodworkers Guild of America. Woodworkers Guild of America is your online resource for woodworking instructions, ideas, and information. If it's a woodworking topic, they got you covered. In this case, they have a bunch of videos on lumber, including one on old growth versus new growth, and how do you spot the differences, and why is there a difference? Well, you're gonna have to check out their video to find out. If raw lumber is in your thing, how about videos on veneering, or cabinet making, or even boat construction? They've got blog articles, they got full woodworking plans, they got it all. As a member, you'll have access to Woodworkers Guild of America's live streaming tutorials and Q&As where expert instructors share their tips and answer questions and engage with your fellow community members. I'm a premium member and I have to say, it's pretty awesome. So this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna put a link down in the video description below. The first 1,000 people that go down to the video description and click on the link, they're gonna get a full year premium membership to Woodworkers Guild of America for only $1.49. That's pretty great. Thank you to Woodworkers Guild of America for sponsoring this video. Now, let me show you something that's really important on the stamp. The next thing on my stamp you'll see is number 2 prime. Well, that's the grade of the wood. Lumber is graded on strength. Appearance is a separate thing. Usually you have select structural, number 1, number 2, and it just kind of goes down from there. This is based off a whole bunch of factors, such as how many knots are in a board, how big are they, how many holes are in the board, how close together are they, what's the warp of the board, the wane of the board, the grain flow. There's a lot involved to determine the grade. The word prime means that this board looks nicer the most. For it to be stamped prime, that means it has to meet certain aesthetic standards. And it also means that you could have a higher graded board that looks uglier than a lower graded board that's prime. Remember that the grading is based off the structural integrity, the strength of the board, not necessarily the appearance. Here's a quick breakdown from best to worst based off the grade and the appearance. Just know that there are a lot of lumberyards out there. This is not exact science. Not everyone's gonna grade things exactly the same. There's also some marketing mumbo jumbo out there, such as flooring, that will often say that prime is better than select, but again, you're looking at appearances versus strength, and you might also see stamps that say stud or standard or utility. These are usually for light framing. They're not gonna be the best quality structurally or aesthetically, but they get the job done. If you wanna save money and you don't care about appearances or how straight the boards are or how wonky they are, then go for utility because they're the lowest of the low. Next part of my stamp says KD19HT. That's a mouthful, but it means a whole lot. All this is the seasoning of the board, which is like the moisture content or any other treatments that were done to it. KD means it is kiln dried. 19 means that it has a maximum moisture of 19%. In this case, I know this board was drying in a kiln to 19%. It could be a little bit under, but it's probably gonna be above 15 because there's a different stamp for that you can use. You may see KD15, so it's 15% moisture content. It may actually say MC 15, as in moisture content 15, it means the same thing. It means that the moisture in the board got down to 15%. You might see some other stamps that are not KD or MC, but they all follow the same meaning. So it might be 80, air dried, or green. Really what that means is it wasn't dried in a kiln if it's air dried, or it wasn't dried down to 19% or less. The lower the moisture content, the more expensive it's gonna be because that's more processing time that the mill has to go through. So that means a green board is gonna be a little bit cheaper than a KD 19. A kiln dried 19 is gonna be a little bit cheaper than a KD 15 or 15% moisture. If you're looking at two boards in the lumberyard and you're wondering what's the difference that justifies the price, look at the stamp and see what the moisture content is because that might be part of it. It's also important to look at that because now you know if all your boards are going to be the same or not. That way you're not having a bunch of green lumber and throwing in a board with 15% moisture content all together and the stuff's not drying all at the same time. Earlier I said that KD 19 HT is the seasoning of it. I didn't just say moisture content, it's the seasoning or the whole treatment. And that's where the HT comes into. HT means that it was heat treated. They took this board and they had to put it into an oven or heat it up to at least 133 degrees Fahrenheit inside the core of the board for 30 minutes or more. The whole point in that is to kill any sort of bugs or anything that might be in the wood. And if you're gonna export lumber, you gotta heat treat it. Heat treating is not the same as drying it out with the moisture content, but it's all kind of goes into the one seasoning pot. Then we have the next stamp, which is 143F, and that's the sawmill, and I think that's really cool. On all these different stamps, you can take the number and trace back the lumber to find out exactly where it came from. The exact sawmill, the location of it. In my case, I was able to track this down to Fulton, Alabama, and I can see all the different types of lumber they produce. Now, you can usually do this by going over to whatever the inspection agency's website is, like SPIB, and then doing a search for the sawmill number under that website. The next part of my stamp should say the wood species, but mine doesn't have one. And this is because it was inspected under SPIB rules, which says that lumber does not have to have the species if it's southern yellow pine or southern pine. You might also see stamps that say SYP or SP for southern yellow pine or southern pine, but it's not required. It does have to say it if it's not southern yellow pine, and usually it will say something like SPF or spruce pine fir. And this is a collection of about 10 different types of species in the United States that are the minor species, and they all kind of fit into that one category. I got some examples of other stamps that show the species, so I'm gonna show you those. Should have cut this down, that would have made my life easier. This is a 2x6 I picked up, and I can look at it as a different type of stamp. So this one has the NELMA Neoma from Maine, so it's not going to be a Southern Pine Inspection Bureau, but the same rules apply. So we have the inspection agency, 165, which is the sawmill. Then we have the number 2, which is the grate. So in this case, it's a number 2 board. It's not number 2 prime, so it's not going to look as nice. It's simply number 2. When you call something a number 2, it doesn't sound like it's very pretty, huh? Next it says KDHT, which is kiln dried, heat treated. It doesn't have a number like the last board, so it doesn't say like KD19. That's okay. If it says KD on it, then it means it has a maximum moisture content of 19%. And it has HT in it, which means that it went through the same heat treating process as the other one. Now this is something to really pay attention to on these stamps. And this one says 1/4 radius. So that means that the actual edges of the board have a round over of 1/4 inch. The standard is 1/8 of an inch, but you can have it bigger than that and have more of a round over, but it needs to be designated. So in this case, instead of have 1/8 of an inch, these edges are rounded over 1/4, so it had to be stamped 1/4 inch. If you're gonna take this lumber and you wanted to plane it down and actually make something nicer with it, not just use it for like framing inside a wall, then maybe you don't want to have those radiuses because then that's going to be more material that you have to cut away to square up your board. That's lost material, that's lost money. It's also going to help so that you don't end up buying an eclectic mix of stuff where you have some that's 1/8, some that it's 1/4, and you don't realize that they're all mixed together. It's kind of hard to tell because it's rough lumber. Look for the stamp. Then we've got the stamp SPF, and there's this little bitty S, this little baby S right there. SPF, as we said, is the spruce pine firs. The S is important because it means southern. That means that it came from the United States. If it is just SPF, then that means that it could have come from Canada, where they cut down the tree and processed the logs there. But if it's from the United States, they're supposed to have an S there. Let me go check what else I got in the shop. I didn't expect to find this one. This one's really cool. It's the WWP, so that's the Western Wood Products. This is the one that's out in Oregon. So I wouldn't have expected that I would find lumber in my shop from the West Coast. I used to live out west, but it was many, many years ago, and I didn't have this shop. So I don't know how I got this. Then we've got 94, that's gonna be the sawmill. It's rated as a number 2, kiln dried, heat treated, just like the other ones. And this one says 1/4 EE, which is the same thing as before. It's a 1/4 inch eased edge, which is just a fancy way of saying the radius. I didn't round those over, I eased the edges. Then we got the species stamp. So this one says DFIR, so this was Douglas fir. Because I live in Michigan, I do have a couple here that are Canadian. In this case, we've got AFPA, and then we have NLGA. So essentially NLGA is like the regulatory body for Canada when it comes to lumber standards. And then you have all the different accrediting agencies that follow that. The sawmill was number 67. This was graded as a number 2, and we know that it is spruce pine fir. It's one of those mixes. Now, I do believe that Canada doesn't have the 10 different spurfs. I'm gonna call it spurfs from now on. Spruce pine firs, it's spurfs. It had to be heat treated or wasn't gonna get across the border into the United States, so that was important. And then the kiln dried means that it was dried to a maximum of 19%. This is another Canadian stamp by the maple leaf stamp that they have there. Sits at number 2. Kiln dried, heat treated. And then this one is a spurf, spruce pine fir. Hopefully this little bit of knowledge is gonna help you out next time you're shopping for lumber, and a big thank you to the superhero community over on Patreon that helps me out and allows me to make more videos and to meet again, get in your shop and build something awesome after you bought lumber in an educated manner by looking at the stamps.